Nobody talks about them. Not in the textbooks. Not in the Hollywood movies. Not in the speeches politicians give every 4th of July when they stand in front of fireworks and talk about the brave men who built this nation. They talk about George Washington crossing the Delaware. They talk about Paul Revere riding through the night. They talk about Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm. These are the stories that get told, retold, and turned into myths so big they barely feel real anymore. But there are other stories. Stories that never made it into the textbooks. Stories of people who bled, sacrificed, and died for a revolution that would not remember their names. This is their story. To understand who was forgotten, you have to understand the world they lived in. It is 1770. The British Empire is the most powerful force on earth. It controls vast stretches of land across every continent. Its navy rules every ocean. Its soldiers wear red coats and march in precise lines that seem almost mechanical, almost unstoppable. When people think of power, they think of Britain. The American colonies are part of that empire. 13 colonies stretched along the eastern edge of a massive continent, home to roughly 2.5 million people. And those people are increasingly angry. The taxes are part of it. The Stamp Act. The Townshend Acts. The idea that Parliament in London, thousands of miles away, can tax people who have no representation in that Parliament. That anger is real, and it is growing. But here is what the history books often forget to mention: those 2.5 million people were not all the same. They were not one community with one voice and one shared dream of freedom. They were a complicated, fractured society full of people with different races, different religions, different classes, different genders, and wildly different ideas about what this new world should look like. Some of them were enslaved. Almost 500,000 black men and women were held in bondage across the colonies, more in the South than the North, but present everywhere. They had no say in the coming revolution. They had no vote. They had no rights recognized by law. And yet, they would fight in it. They would die in it. And many of them would be betrayed by it. Some of them were women. Half the population, as it always is, and yet completely excluded from the political process that was building toward revolution. They could not vote. They could not own property in most cases. Their lives were shaped entirely by fathers and husbands. And yet, they would hold the revolution together in ways that no one bothered to write down. Some of them were Native Americans. Indigenous peoples had been living on this continent for thousands of years before European colonizers arrived. Now they were caught between two forces, the British and the American colonists, both of whom had their own ideas about what to do with indigenous land. The revolution would be catastrophic for most native nations. And yet some of them chose sides. Some of them fought. And none of them would be remembered. Some of them were recent immigrants. German settlers in Pennsylvania. Scots-Irish farmers in the backcountry. Jewish merchants in port cities. People from everywhere, all trying to make a life in a world that was about to explode. This is the world that would produce the American Revolution. Not a neat story of unified patriots rising up against a tyrant. A complicated, messy, human story of people from every background imaginable, fighting for survival, for freedom, for land, for dignity, for reasons that were sometimes noble and sometimes not. The forgotten heroes came from all of these groups. And their stories deserve to be told. Let us begin with a man named Agrippa. He was born free in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1759. Freeborn black men in New England were a small but significant community. They went to church. Some owned property. They paid taxes. They were part of their communities in ways that the laws did not always fully recognize but that daily life made undeniable. When the war broke out, Agrippa was 16 years old. He did what many young men of his time and place did: he enlisted. He served for 6 years, an extraordinary length of service, working as an orderly to the Polish general Tadeusz Kosciuszko, one of the most important foreign officers to fight in the American cause. Hull and Kosciuszko developed a remarkable relationship. The general, who would later become one of the great advocates for human rights in the early modern world, treated Hull with respect and dignity. Hull, for his part, was witty, brave, and devoted. He became something of a legend in his regiment, known for his humor and his courage in equal measure. But here is what makes Agrippa Hull's story both inspiring and heartbreaking: he fought for 6 years for American freedom. He survived the war. He went back to Massachusetts. He lived a long life, dying in 1838 at the age of 78. And he spent decades watching the nation he had helped create refuse to extend the freedoms he had fought for to people who looked like him. He was not alone. Approximately 5,000 black soldiers served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Most of them are not named in any textbook. Most of them fought under desperate circumstances, often joining the army because military service offered something that enslaved life did not: the possibility of freedom. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, understood this. In November 1775, he issued what became known as Dunmore's Proclamation. He promised freedom to any enslaved person owned by a rebel colonist who escaped and joined the British forces. Within weeks, hundreds of enslaved people had fled to British lines. By the end of the war, tens of thousands would make the journey. This created a crisis for the Continental Army. If the British were offering freedom to enslaved people, the Americans would need to match that offer, or they would lose a significant potential fighting force. Some states began allowing black soldiers to serve. Rhode Island created an entire regiment, the 1st Rhode Island, made up largely of black soldiers who had been promised freedom in exchange for service. The 1st Rhode Island proved itself at the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778. Outnumbered and under heavy fire from Hessian mercenaries, these men held their position through 3 separate charges. They did not break. They did not run. They fought with a discipline and courage that impressed even their opponents. And then the war ended. And most of them did not get the freedom they had been promised. Some did. Some black soldiers who had served in the Continental Army received their freedom and went on to live as free men in the new nation. But many were returned to slavery. The promises made in wartime were forgotten the moment they became inconvenient. There is a name you should know: Salem Poor. A free black man from Massachusetts, he enlisted in 1775 and fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the first major engagements of the war. He fought so bravely, with such extraordinary courage, that 14 officers signed a petition to the Massachusetts General Court praising his valor. They called him a brave and gallant soldier. They said the country had in him an experienced officer. Nothing came of it. Salem Poor continued to serve. He was at Valley Forge during that terrible winter of 1777 to 1778. He survived. He came home. And almost no one outside of dedicated historians has ever heard his name. Another name, Peter Salem. Also at Bunker Hill. According to multiple accounts, he fired the shot that killed British Major John Pitcairn, one of the highest-ranking British officers to die that day. The shot that killed Pitcairn may have been the most impactful single shot fired at Bunker Hill. And it was fired by a formerly enslaved man. Peter Salem had been granted his freedom specifically so he could enlist. He served for years. He survived the war. He came home to Massachusetts and spent the rest of his life weaving cane chairs to make ends meet. He died in poverty in 1816. There is a painting, commissioned years after the battle, depicting the heroism of Bunker Hill. Peter Salem appears in it. He is a tiny figure in the background, barely noticeable. The men in the foreground, the men whose names are large and whose poses are heroic, are white. That is a metaphor for everything. If you want to understand the American Revolution, you need to understand what women did. Not the romanticized version. Not Betsy Ross sewing a flag, a story that is almost certainly myth and was not even told until decades after the Revolution. Not Abigail Adams writing her famous letters, though those letters are genuinely remarkable and deserve their place in the story. Not the few, exceptional women whose names occasionally make it into the textbooks. The real version. The version where women were not just supporting characters but essential infrastructure without which the revolution would have failed. Consider what happened when the men went to war. The farms did not run themselves. The shops did not run themselves. The children did not raise themselves. The food did not get grown, preserved, or cooked by magic. When hundreds of thousands of men left their homes to fight, someone had to do everything they had been doing. That someone was women. Women ran farms. They negotiated with merchants. They managed finances. They made decisions about when to plant and when to harvest, when to sell and when to hold, what to buy and what to make do without. Women who had never been allowed to participate in business found themselves running businesses. Women who had been told they were not capable of managing money found themselves managing the family's entire economic survival. And they did it. Not perfectly, because perfection is not a human trait, but competently, resourcefully, and often brilliantly. Esther de Bert Reed understood this, and she decided to organize it. In 1780, Washington's army was in desperate shape. The soldiers were cold, hungry, unpaid, and exhausted. Reed, the wife of Pennsylvania's governor, had an idea. She would raise money from the women of Philadelphia to support the troops. She wrote a pamphlet called The Sentiments of an American Woman. It was extraordinary. It argued that women were not passive observers of the revolution but active participants with both the right and the duty to contribute. She was not asking women to bake and sew and stay quiet. She was arguing for women as political actors, as citizens in everything but name. She organized a door-to-door campaign across Philadelphia. Women went house to house, asking their neighbors to contribute. Some doors were slammed in their faces. Some people mocked them. But they raised the equivalent of roughly $300,000 in modern money. It was a significant sum, and it came at a critical moment. Reed died before the campaign was fully completed, a casualty of dysentery at age 33. But Sarah Franklin Back, Benjamin Franklin's daughter, took over and completed the work. The money was used to buy linen, which the women then sewed themselves into shirts for the soldiers. 2,000 shirts, each with the name of the woman who made it embroidered inside. Washington received the shirts and wrote a letter of thanks. He was polite, but he had wanted something different. He had wanted the money given directly to pay the soldiers. Reed had insisted on the shirts because she did not trust that money given to the army would actually reach the individual soldiers rather than disappearing into the bureaucratic chaos that plagued the Continental Army's finances. She was probably right. Now consider another woman. Her name was Deborah Sampson, and she did something that was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily desperate or quite possibly both. She disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army. She enlisted in 1782, near the end of the war, under the name Robert Shirtliff. She served for 17 months. She was wounded twice. The first time, she extracted a musket ball from her own thigh rather than seek medical attention and risk being discovered. The second time, she was brought to a hospital with a fever, and a doctor named Barnabas Binney discovered her secret. He did not immediately turn her in. Instead, he took her to his home, where his family cared for her while she recovered. After the war, he helped her obtain an honorable discharge from the army. She was discharged in 1783. She went home to Massachusetts, married, had children, and eventually became one of the first women in American history to give a public lecture tour. She spoke about her experiences in the army, dressed in her old military uniform, performing military drills on stage. People paid to watch her. She was a kind of celebrity. But she never received a proper pension. She applied. Congress debated. The debates focused heavily on whether a woman could or should receive a soldier's pension, as if the question of what she had actually done was secondary to the question of her gender. Eventually, after years of petitioning, she received a partial pension. After her death, her husband applied for a widow's pension, which created the absurd legal situation of a man seeking a widow's pension for a woman who had served as a soldier. Congress eventually granted it. Margaret Cochrane Corbin accompanied her husband to the front as a camp follower. When her husband was killed at the Battle of Fort Washington in November 1776, she took his place manning an artillery cannon. She continued firing until she herself was severely wounded, losing most of the use of her left arm for the rest of her life. She was captured by the British. Eventually exchanged. She received a pension from the Continental Congress, for half the pay and provisions of a soldier. Half. She spent her remaining years in poverty near West Point. She died around 1800. More than a century later, her remains were moved to the cemetery at West Point, where a monument was finally erected to her memory. The monument is there today. Most people walk past it without knowing what it means. The American Revolution was, among other things, a disaster for Native Americans. This is not a controversial statement among historians. It is simply what happened. The Revolution removed the British, who had at least attempted to limit colonial expansion into indigenous territory with the Proclamation of 1763. The new American nation had no such constraints and no such inclinations. The result was a century of accelerating dispossession, forced removal, and violence against native peoples. But during the revolution itself, native nations were not simply victims. They were also actors, making complicated choices under impossible circumstances. The Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee, was one of the most sophisticated political confederacies in the world. 6 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, had maintained a union for centuries, united by what Europeans called the Great Law of Peace. The Revolution broke the Iroquois Confederacy apart. 4 nations, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, sided with the British. They had good reasons. Britain had at least theoretically committed to limiting colonial expansion. The American colonists, in contrast, had been steadily encroaching on Iroquois land for generations, and there was every reason to believe they would continue to do so, revolution or no revolution. 2 nations, the Oneida and Tuscarora, sided with the Americans. They had developed relationships with American missionaries and settlers in their communities. Some of their leaders believed that supporting the colonists would protect their lands and their people. Both groups were wrong. Both groups would eventually lose their lands to the expanding American Republic. But during the Revolution, they made their choices and lived with the consequences. The Oneidas fought for the Continental Army. They fought well. At the Battle of Oriskany in August 1777, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war in terms of casualties per soldiers engaged, Oneida warriors fought alongside American militia against a force of British soldiers, loyalists, and their Iroquois allies. The battle was essentially a civil war within the Iroquois Confederacy, Oneida fighting against Mohawk and Seneca. The slaughter at Oriskany was terrible. The Americans and their Oneida allies were ambushed. The fighting was close range, brutal, hand-to-hand at times. The American commander, General Nicholas Herkimer, was shot through the leg early in the battle. He refused to be carried from the field. He sat propped against a tree, smoking his pipe, and continued to direct the battle until he lost enough blood that he could no longer function. He died of his wounds 10 days later. There is a name you should know from this story, Polly Cooper. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army was starving at Valley Forge. The Oneidas, despite being under enormous pressure themselves, sent a delegation to Valley Forge with corn. They also sent Polly Cooper, a woman who knew how to prepare the dried corn in a way that would be nutritious and digestible for men who were not used to eating it. She stayed at Valley Forge for months. She taught the soldiers how to prepare the food. She helped nurse the sick. She was invaluable. When she was ready to leave, the officers wanted to pay her. She refused. She said the food and her help were gifts, not a commercial transaction. They were given freely to friends in need. Martha Washington was so moved by Polly Cooper's generosity and dignity that she used her own money to buy Cooper a shawl and a bonnet as gifts. Polly Cooper went home to her people. The story survived in Oneida oral tradition, passed down through generations. It was not recorded in American history books. Now consider Thayendanegea, known to the British and Americans as Joseph Brant. He was a Mohawk military and political leader who had been educated at a school in Connecticut, had visited London twice and met King George III, and moved with equal facility in Mohawk and British society. Brant led Mohawk and other Iroquois forces in a series of devastating raids on American settlements in New York and Pennsylvania throughout 1778 and 1779. From the American perspective, Brant was a fearsome enemy. From the British and Mohawk perspective, he was a military leader fighting for his people and his allies. The historical truth is more complicated than either portrait. Brant was fighting for Mohawk survival. He understood, correctly as it turned out, that an American victory would mean the end of Mohawk territorial sovereignty. He was trying to prevent that. He failed, but his actions were those of a desperate leader using every tool available to him. After the revolution, Brant spent the rest of his life working to secure some kind of future for his people. He negotiated with the American and British governments. He sought land in Canada for the Mohawks who had been displaced. He never stopped fighting, politically if no longer militarily, for Mohawk rights. He is a complicated figure. But he deserves to be in the story. The revolution almost went bankrupt. This is not a metaphor. The Continental Congress was perpetually, desperately broke. The Continental dollar was worthless. Soldiers were not paid. Supplies were not purchased. The army was held together by something that was more faith than substance for much of the war. Into this crisis stepped a network of financiers, merchants, and businesspeople who loaned their own money and credit to keep the revolution alive. One of them deserves special attention. His name was Haym Salomon. He was a Polish-born Jewish immigrant who had come to America in 1772, just in time to become one of the most important financial figures of the revolution. Salomon was a brilliant financial broker. He spoke multiple languages fluently, which made him invaluable in negotiating with the Dutch and French bankers whose loans were keeping the American cause afloat. He worked closely with Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance who was desperately trying to keep the American government solvent. Salomon also personally loaned enormous sums of money to the Continental Congress and to individual founding fathers. James Madison, who would later become the fourth President of the United States, wrote repeatedly to Salomon asking for financial help. Madison was a Virginia planter who had plenty of land and no liquid cash, and Salomon loaned him money without interest, multiple times, to allow him to continue his work in Congress. Salomon helped finance the Yorktown Campaign, the final major battle of the war, which led to British surrender. He raised money under impossible circumstances, using his networks and his personal credit to keep the army supplied. He died in 1785, just 2 years after the peace treaty was signed. He was 45 years old. He died essentially broke. All the money he had loaned to the revolution had not been repaid. His family was left in poverty. Years later, his descendants would spend decades trying to get the American government to repay what Salomon had been owed. They never succeeded. Congress considered the matter multiple times and never acted. There is a statue of Haym Salomon in Chicago, part of a monument that also includes George Washington and Robert Morris. His name is on it. But most Americans have never heard of him. He kept the revolution from going broke. And he has been forgotten. Here is an uncomfortable truth: not everyone in the colonies wanted revolution. About a third of the colonial population was loyalist, meaning they remained loyal to the British Crown. Another third was essentially neutral, trying to stay out of trouble and survive. Only about a third were active patriots. The Loyalists are almost never discussed in American history as having their own legitimate perspective. They are usually presented as villains, as traitors, as people who were on the wrong side. But if you try to understand the revolution as it actually happened rather than as mythology, you have to take the Loyalists seriously. Many Loyalists opposed the revolution for principled reasons. They believed that the break with Britain was unnecessary, that the colonial grievances could be resolved within the British system, and that independence would lead to chaos. They were not entirely wrong. The years immediately following independence were extremely chaotic. Many Loyalists were members of religious and ethnic minorities who had reason to fear what an independent American government might do. Jewish communities in some cities had enjoyed protections under British law that were not guaranteed to continue. Native Americans had good reason to prefer British oversight to American expansion. Black Loyalists who had escaped slavery to fight for the British had even stronger reasons to fear an American victory. When the Revolution ended, the Loyalists paid a terrible price. Those who had not already fled had their property confiscated. Many were driven from their homes. About 60,000 to 80,000 Loyalists went into exile, the largest forced migration in North American history to that point. They went to Canada, to Britain, to the Caribbean. They left behind homes, farms, businesses, and communities that they had built over generations. Among the Loyalists were black men and women who had earned their freedom by fighting for the British. About 3,000 black Loyalists were evacuated to Nova Scotia in 1783. The land they received was often rocky, infertile, and inadequate. The white Loyalists around them resented their presence. They faced discrimination, violence, and poverty. In 1791, about 1,200 of them made another extraordinary journey. Led by a man named Thomas Peters, who had himself been enslaved, escaped, and fought for the British, they petitioned the British government for better treatment. They eventually emigrated to Sierra Leone in West Africa, joining a British-backed settlement of free black people. Thomas Peters had been enslaved in North Carolina. He had escaped and joined the British Army. He had survived the war. He had gone to Nova Scotia. He had organized his community. He had sailed to London to petition the government. He had crossed the Atlantic to Sierra Leone. He died 4 months after arriving in Sierra Leone, worn out by decades of struggle. But the community he helped establish survived. His descendants are part of Sierra Leone today. His name appears in no American textbook. It is easy to talk about the notable individuals. It is harder to talk about the ordinary soldiers, the men and boys, because many of them were boys, who signed up for what they thought would be a quick fight and found themselves in a years-long nightmare. Valley Forge is the symbol of what those men endured. The winter of 1777 to 1778, when Washington's army encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, after a series of defeats. They were hungry. They were cold. They were sick. Their shoes had worn through. Some men walked through snow leaving bloody footprints. About 2,500 men died at Valley Forge. Not in battle. From disease, exposure, and malnutrition. 1 in 6 did not survive the winter. Who were these men? They were farmers and tradespeople and fishermen. They were recent immigrants from Germany and Ireland and Scotland. They were free black men from New England. They were teenagers who had lied about their age to enlist. They were middle-aged men who had left families behind. They were people who believed in something enough to suffer extraordinary hardship for it. Their names are not famous. Most of their names are not even recorded. They appear in muster rolls as brief entries: name, age, home state, sometimes occupation. Then they disappear from history. Private Joseph Plum Martin is one of the exceptions, and only because he later wrote a memoir of his experiences. He enlisted at age 15 in 1776 from Connecticut. He served for nearly the entire war. He was at Valley Forge. He wrote about watching his fellow soldiers suffer, about the terrible food and the terrible cold and the impossible conditions. He also wrote about something else. He wrote about the extraordinary resilience of the men around him. About their humor, their ability to find moments of joy and comradeship in the midst of misery. About the songs they sang and the games they played and the way they helped each other survive. Martin survived the war. He came home. He married. He had children. He was promised land as part of his compensation for military service. He never received it. He spent years petitioning for his pension and his land grant. He was one of the last surviving Continental soldiers and one of the most vocal critics of the way the government had treated the men who had actually fought the revolution. His memoir, published in 1830 when he was in his 70s, is one of the most important documents of the revolution. It is the revolution seen from the bottom up, from the perspective of the ordinary soldier, not the general on horseback. It is funny and bitter and heartbreaking and honest. Most people have never heard of it. Wars are not won only with guns. They are also won with information. And the American Revolution was won in part by an extraordinary network of spies, many of whom have never been recognized. James Armistead was a Virginia slave who approached the Marquis de Lafayette in 1781 with a plan. He would enter British lines posing as a runaway slave willing to work for the British Army. From there, he would gather intelligence and report back to Lafayette. Lafayette agreed. Armistead penetrated British lines and got himself assigned to serve under General Benedict Arnold, the American traitor who had defected to the British. Arnold trusted him. Armistead gathered critical information about British troop movements and plans. He passed this information to Lafayette. Then, in one of the most remarkable developments of the entire episode, the British also began using Armistead as a spy. They trusted him as well, and they sent him back to American lines carrying disinformation they wanted Lafayette to believe. Armistead was simultaneously a spy for the Americans and a double agent feeding false information back to the British. The intelligence he provided to Lafayette was real and important. The information he fed to the British was presumably false or useless. The intelligence James Armistead gathered contributed directly to the Yorktown Campaign, the decisive final battle of the Revolution. When the British Army under Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, it was in part because of intelligence failures that James Armistead had helped engineer. After the war, Armistead was returned to slavery. He had served the Revolution bravely and brilliantly. But Virginia law did not provide for the freedom of enslaved people who had served as spies, as opposed to soldiers. He had no legal claim to freedom. He petitioned the Virginia legislature. He waited. He continued to be enslaved while the nation he had helped create celebrated its independence. Finally, in 1787, the Virginia legislature granted him his freedom through a special act. He took the surname Lafayette in honor of the French general who had trusted him and worked for his emancipation. James Armistead Lafayette lived as a free man for the rest of his long life. When Lafayette returned to America on a triumphant tour in 1824, James Armistead Lafayette went to see him. The two men, the French general and the formerly enslaved spy who had helped him win the war, embraced. Lafayette later wrote that Armistead had been one of the most important contributors to the American victory. His extraordinary story should be told in every school in America. History has a bias toward action and drama. It records battles and speeches and votes. It does not record, or records only partially, the daily work that makes those battles and speeches and votes possible. This is why so many women's contributions to the revolution have been lost. The camp followers. Those women who traveled with the armies, cooking and washing and nursing and sewing, are almost completely invisible in the historical record. Estimates suggest that for every 4 or 5 soldiers in the Continental Army, there was roughly one woman working as a camp follower. That means thousands of women were part of the Army's daily operation. Their labor was essential. Without them, the army would have collapsed. We know almost none of their names. The image of Molly Pitcher, a woman carrying water to soldiers at the Battle of Monmouth, became a kind of composite myth representing all the women who had done this work. The real Molly Pitcher was probably Mary Ludwig Hayes, the wife of an artilleryman. At the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, she was carrying water when her husband was wounded. She stepped in and helped man the cannon for the rest of the battle. After the war, Pennsylvania gave her a pension. The documentation describes her as having performed extraordinary military services during the Revolutionary War. It was an unusual official recognition of a woman's combat role. Elizabeth Bergen helped organize the escape of more than 200 American prisoners of war from British prison ships in New York Harbor. Prison ships were floating nightmares, disease-ridden and brutally overcrowded, where American prisoners died by the thousands. Getting men off those ships was extraordinarily dangerous work. The British put a bounty on Bergen's head. She had to flee New York and spent the rest of the war hiding, moving from place to place to avoid capture. Congress eventually gave her a pension, acknowledging what she had done. Most people have never heard of her. Grace and Rachel Martin, South Carolina women whose husbands were away at war, disguised themselves in their husbands' clothes, ambushed a British courier, and captured dispatches containing important intelligence. They did this on their own initiative, without instruction or authorization from anyone. They were just two women who saw an opportunity to help and took it. They went home after the ambush, changed back into their regular clothes, and received the British officers who were pursuing the robbers, serving them dinner as gracious hostesses while sitting on the dispatches. The officers had no idea. Their names appear occasionally in local South Carolina history. They are completely unknown nationally. Lydia Dara, a Quaker woman in Philadelphia, reportedly eavesdropped on British officers who had requisitioned a room in her house for meetings and passed information to American forces. The story suggests the kind of ordinary heroism that was happening everywhere, in small acts of resistance and information gathering, entirely unrecorded. These women were not supporting characters. They were the revolution's invisible spine. The revolution ended. Britain surrendered. The United States of America became a sovereign nation. And then the question that had been deferred throughout the revolution, the question of who, exactly, freedom was for, became impossible to avoid. The answer, written into the Constitution and the legal structures of the new nation, was deeply limited. Freedom was for white men who owned property. Women could not vote. Black people, enslaved and free, had no political rights. Native Americans were considered outside the political community entirely. Poor white men who did not meet property requirements could not vote in many states. The people who had fought for the revolution and then been excluded from its benefits knew exactly what had happened. They were not confused about it. They did not miss the irony. Peter Salem, who may have fired the shot that killed a British major at Bunker Hill, died in poverty. Agrippa, who served 6 years, watched his country refuse to extend freedom to his people for the rest of his long life. The Oneida warriors who fought alongside the Americans had their land taken. Haym Salomon, who financed the revolution, died bankrupt and uncompensated. James Armistead Lafayette was returned to slavery. These were not accidents. These were choices. The Founding Fathers were not naive men who did not understand the contradictions in their position. Many of them wrote and spoke at length about those contradictions. Some, like John Adams, were troubled by them. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, were troubled and hypocritical simultaneously. Some seemed barely troubled at all. But they made choices. And the choices they made ensured that the revolution's benefits would flow primarily to people who already had power and privilege, while the people who had contributed most and expected the most would be left waiting. That waiting has never fully ended. The struggle for full equality, for Black Americans, for women, for Native peoples, for immigrants, for everyone who was excluded from the revolution's original promise, has continued for more than 2 centuries. It continues today. It is, in a very real sense, the same revolution, still unfinished. Understanding the forgotten heroes is not just an exercise in historical justice, though it is that. It is also a way of understanding the present. The contradictions and struggles and unfinished business of the American Revolution did not disappear when the last shots were fired and the treaties were signed. They became the DNA of the new nation, built into its structure, shaping everything that followed. When you know who was forgotten, you understand why the work of building a more perfect union has been so difficult and so long. And you understand something about what that work requires, not just laws and policies, but memory. The willingness to look clearly at the past, including the parts that are painful and complicated and inconvenient, and to honor the people who deserve to be honored. They deserve to be honored now. Let us say their names one more time. Agrippa Hull. Free black soldier from Massachusetts. 6 years of service. He came home and watched his country fail to extend freedom to his people. He lived to 78 and remembered everything. Peter Salem. Formerly enslaved man who may have fired the most consequential shot at Bunker Hill. He came home and wove cane chairs until he died in poverty. Salem Poor. Free black soldier who fought so bravely at Bunker Hill that 14 officers petitioned for his recognition. He received none. The soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island. The regiment of black men who held the line under 3 charges at the Battle of Rhode Island. They did not break. Their names are largely unrecorded. Deborah Sampson. The woman who disguised herself as a man and served for 17 months, extracting a bullet from her own leg rather than be discovered. She fought for a pension for years and received one belatedly, partially, and only after extraordinary effort. Margaret Cochran Corbin. Who took her wounded husband's place at the cannon at Fort Washington and continued firing until she herself was severely wounded. She received a half pension and died in poverty. Esther de Burt Reed. Who organized women as political actors, raised a small fortune for the troops, and died at 33 of dysentery, her work unfinished. Polly Cooper. The Oneida woman who traveled to Valley Forge with corn and stayed for months, teaching the soldiers how to survive, refusing payment as a matter of dignity and friendship. The Oneida warriors at Oriskany. Who fought alongside the Americans and had their lands taken by those same Americans after the war. Thayendanegea. Joseph Brant. The Mohawk leader who fought brilliantly for his people and lost everything, and who spent the rest of his life trying to secure some kind of future for the nation he loved. Thomas Peters. Who was enslaved, escaped, fought for the British, went to Nova Scotia, organized his community, crossed the Atlantic, and died 4 months after reaching Sierra Leone. He built something that survived him. Haym Salomon. Who loaned the revolution the money it needed to survive, died bankrupt, and was never repaid. James Armistead Lafayette. Who penetrated British lines, gathered intelligence, operated as a double agent, contributed to the victory at Yorktown, was returned to slavery, and finally won his freedom by petitioning the legislature of the state he had helped save. Joseph Plum Martin. Who enlisted at 15, fought for nearly the entire war, suffered at Valley Forge, and spent years trying to get the pension and land he had been promised, and who finally wrote it all down so that someone, someday, might know what the ordinary soldiers had actually gone through. The thousands of women camp followers whose names are not recorded but whose labor kept the army alive. The thousands of black soldiers whose names are listed only in muster rolls, if they are listed at all. The indigenous warriors on every side of the conflict, Oneida and Mohawk and Cherokee and dozens of other nations, who made desperate choices under impossible circumstances and lost everything regardless. All of them. All of them are part of the American Revolution. All of them helped make it. All of them were shaped by it, limited by it, betrayed by it, or lifted by it. The American Revolution is not a simple story about brave patriots defeating a tyrant and winning freedom. It is a complicated, messy, human story about a society at war with itself and the world, about high ideals and terrible betrayals, about courage and sacrifice from people who were never given the credit they deserved. Understanding that story does not diminish the revolution. It makes it more real. It makes it more powerful. It makes the achievement more impressive, because you can see how hard it was, how close it came to failing, how many different people from how many different backgrounds contributed to keeping it alive. These are long stories. They are still being written. But they begin here. In a world that was more complicated than the textbooks acknowledge, with people who were braver than the stories remember, fighting for a freedom that was more contested and more elusive than the mythology suggests. They were real. They were here. They did these things. And they deserve to be remembered. This is their story. And it is ours.